Every model of equine acceleration developed in the 20th century tells us that a racehorse reaches its terminal velocity within the first 3 furlongs. After that, the physics are merciless. Lactic acid floods the muscle tissue, oxygen debt accumulates, the body begins its negotiation with exhaustion, and from that point forward, the race becomes a managed decline. Every horse slows. The question is only which one slows least. On June 10, 1978, Affirmed did not slow, not in the 4th furlong, not in the 5th, not when Alidar pulled alongside him with half a mile remaining and every stopwatch in the press box braced for the inevitable collapse. The data recorded that afternoon at Belmont Park does not conform to the standard degradation curve. It does not fit the biomechanical models. It sits in the historical record like a splinter that biology cannot dislodge, a set of fractional times produced by an animal that, by every accepted principle of equine physiology, should have been decelerating. He was not decelerating. What happened that afternoon was not simply a horse winning a race, it was a creature operating under what appeared to be a separate set of physical laws, laws that had been quietly rewriting themselves across the entire Triple Crown campaign of 1978, building toward a moment that the sport has spent 4 decades trying to fully explain. It has not fully explained it yet. The experts had their position clearly established long before the gates opened that June. Going into the 1978 Kentucky Derby, the consensus among bloodstock analysts, trainers, and racing journalists was not particularly complicated. Alidar was the horse. Alidar, trained by John Veach out of Calumet Farm, was the generational talent, a chestnut with a stride so mechanically perfect that veteran clockers described watching him gallop as something close to uncomfortable. The way perfection sometimes is. The breeding was impeccable, the works were staggering, the pedigree told a story that practically wrote itself. Affirmed, they conceded, was very good. Las Barrera's bay colt had talent, certainly, but talent arranged itself in a hierarchy that spring, and Affirmed occupied the tier just beneath the heir apparent. Industry experts said the gap would be settled quickly. The bloodstock community had already written their rankings. The clockers at Churchill Downs whispered about Alidar's final works and shook their heads with something approaching reverence. They were all watching the same 2 horses. Very few of them were seeing what Las Barrera saw, and what Barrera saw, he kept to himself, because what he saw was not in the workout times, it was in the eyes. To understand what Affirmed did across those 3 races, you have to first understand what the Triple Crown actually costs a horse's body. The Kentucky Derby, the Preakness Stakes, and the Belmont Stakes are not simply 3 prestigious races scheduled in proximity, they are a physiological audit. The Derby's mile and a quarter demands peak anaerobic output. The Preakness, 13 days later, finds the body before it has fully resolved the chemical debt from Churchill Downs. The Belmont, 3 weeks after that, arrives when the musculoskeletal system has been operating at competitive intensity for 45 days without adequate recovery. The average racehorse's cortical bone density cannot sustain that demand without consequence. Tendons that absorbed the concussive force of 2 championship efforts at 40 miles per hour are now being asked to absorb a third, and Affirmed had not been racing against an average field. He had been racing against Alidar, specifically, intimately, furlong by furlong, the same horse in all 3 races, a relentless engine that refused to concede ground, that materialized on his flank in the stretch of every race like something attached to him by cable. The psychological demand of that specific rivalry added a dimension to the physical toll that no physiologist had formally modeled before. This was not one horse chasing another, this was 2 locomotives running on the same track, neither willing to yield the rail. By the time they reached Belmont, the question in the barn was no longer whether Affirmed could win. The question, the one that the trainers and veterinarians were asking quietly, away from the cameras, was whether his body had anything left to answer with. The dirt at Belmont Park that afternoon was listed as fast. It was not forgiving. The surface at Belmont has a particular character that experienced clockers describe as punishing, a track that returns energy poorly, that taxes the suspensory ligaments with every footfall, that reveals exhaustion in horses that might hide it on a more cooperative surface. The track was not neutral ground that day, it was an active demand on every horse that stepped onto it. When the gates snapped open, Affirmed broke cleanly. Steve Cawthon settled him into position. Behind them, Jorge Velasquez had Alidar moving. The first fraction came up in 23.8 and 2/5 seconds, reasonable, expected. The second fraction arrived, still together, still locked. The crowd at Belmont had gone to a particular kind of quiet that large crowds sometimes achieve, not silence, exactly, but a compression of sound, as if the air itself was holding something back. At the half-mile, Alidar made his move. He did not ease into it. He came with everything. Velasquez asked for every gear Alidar possessed, and Alidar delivered them. The gap that had separated them evaporated in 3 strides. They were head and head. The crowd released the compression all at once. The roar was immediate and physical. And what happened next is the thing that does not reconcile with the degradation models. Affirmed accelerated, not maintained, not held on. Accelerated. Cawthon had not yet asked for everything. The reserves that physiology insisted should not exist were there, accessed, deployed, and sustained across the final 6 furlongs of a 1.5-mile race that already had no right to produce acceleration at that stage. While rivals fought the track, Affirmed seemed to float over it, as if the physics that governed every other creature had decided to take the day off. Alidar was running the race of his life. The fractional times would confirm it later. Alidar ran that Belmont faster than any second-place finisher in the race's history up to that point. It was not enough. The gap did not close. It held at a head. Then, impossibly, it stretched. The wire came, affirmed by a head. The Triple Crown was complete. The sport should have stopped there and asked the question that the stopwatches were already suggesting. When the veterinary examination was completed in the weeks that followed the race, something in the numbers demanded attention. Affirmed's recovery metrics, the rate at which his cardiovascular system returned to resting baseline following maximum exertion, were documented at a level that placed him in a category that had no established precedent in Triple Crown literature. His heart rate recovery curve was not the curve of a horse that had run 3 championship races in 45 days. It was the curve of an animal whose aerobic machinery operated with an efficiency that conventional models had not anticipated. The average elite racehorse's heart weighs approximately 8 pounds. This is not merely a statistic, it is the mechanical ceiling of the system, the pump that determines how much oxygenated blood reaches the working muscle per minute, which determines how long the machine can sustain its output before the chemistry wins. When the veterinarians finally had access to Affirmed's complete physiological profile, the numbers that emerged did not describe an outlier on the normal distribution. They described an animal whose cardiac output capacity under sustained load existed in a range that the existing literature had classified as theoretical rather than observed. The science had built a box for elite racehorses. Affirmed did not fit inside it. He had never fit inside it. The experts who had ranked him second to Alidar that spring had been measuring the EFO-IT things. They had simply misread what the measurements meant in his specific case, because nothing in the prior data had prepared them for what his specific case would produce. Expert foils are easy to identify in retrospect. The bloodstock agents who had questioned his temperament now had to reconcile that assessment with a horse who had spent 45 days racing at the highest level against the same relentless rival, and never cracked under the psychological pressure of knowing that rival was always there, always close, always one stride from taking everything. The veterinarians who had catalogued the risks of the Triple Crown campaign now had to reconcile their models with recovery data that the models had not predicted. They were not wrong to be cautious. Caution is the appropriate response to what the science predicts. They simply encountered a case where something beyond the science was operating. No Triple Crown campaign since 1978 has been contested under those specific conditions. The same 2 horses, 3 races, the pursuit so sustained and intimate that racing analysts developed new vocabulary to describe it. The head-to-head pressure that Alidar applied across all 3 races was not merely competitive. It was, by the measured standard of fractional times and positional data, the most sustained competitive pressure ever recorded in a Triple Crown series. Affirmed absorbed all of it. He absorbed it and he answered it, race by race, furlong by furlong, in the place on the track where horses are supposed to be running out of answers. He was not running out of answers. The records have been digitized now. The fractional times sit in databases maintained by organizations on 3 continents. The physiological data has been studied, cross-referenced, compared against every subsequent Triple Crown campaign, and integrated into the models that modern sports scientists use to evaluate equine performance potential. The genetics have been analyzed. The pedigree has been mapped and remapped by laboratories that did not exist in 1978. And yet something about what Affirmed produced in the summer of that year remains outside the boundary of what the current models fully account for. The times are real, the margins are verified, The data does not lie and has never been revised, but there is a quality to what happened across those 3 races, a quality that lives specifically in the 6th furlong of the 1978 Belmont Stakes, when a horse that every biological principle said should be decelerating instead found something that the stopwatch measured but the science has never satisfactorily named, that sits beyond the reach of the databases. Perhaps that is where the answer lives. Not in the measurements, but in the space between what we can clock and what we can comprehend. Perhaps what Affirmed demonstrated that summer was not a biological anomaly to be catalogued and explained, but something closer to a question that every generation of racing asks itself and never quite resolves, the question of where the boundary between what a body can do and what a will refuses to accept actually falls. The stopwatches told us where Affirmed finished, they could not tell us what kept him there.